Clerk.
A bill for an act to amend the law in relation to Defence Force retirement benefits and for related purposes. Business of the Senate. Order of the day number 2 for the presentation of the report of the Education and Employment References Committee on its inquiry into the Australian Building and Construction Commission.
Senator Lyons.
Mr Acting Deputy President, pursuant to order, I present the report of the Education and Employment References Committee on the Australian Building and Construction Commission, including the provisions of the Building and Construction Industry Improving Productivity Bill 2013 and any related bills, together with the Hansard record of proceedings and documents presented to the committee, and move that the report be printed.
The question is that that motion be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye. Those against say no. I think the ayes have it.
And I seek leave to move a motion in relation to that report.
Is leave granted? Leave is granted.
And I move that the Senate take note of the report.
Senator Lyons.
So this has got quite a history. These are the ABCC bills, and of course, as the Senate is aware, it is the second introduction by the government of such draconian laws to an industry which has absolutely failed on both occasions to show due cause as to why we need such draconian legislation. And of course, last year in December, the Legislative Committee recommended that the bills re-establishing the ABCC be passed. However, the Legislative Committee did not have the benefit of a significant body of material this committee, the References Committee, has received in evidence through its 3 hearings, evidence that clearly undermines the case for its re-establishment. In December last year, the government and the supporters of these bills wanted the Senate to simply abandon its role to scrutinise and simply pass the bills. The Legislation Committee was given a very short time in which to consider the bills, just 18 days, to hear from submitters and produce a report. Indeed, submitters were rushed too, having a mere 8 days to prepare submissions and gather evidence, and were expected in that time to cover a wide range of complex matters. And then there was only one public hearing, with just 3.5 hours available to the committee to hear evidence from a very wide range number of submitters who had very different points of view. So since the tabling of the Legislative Committee report on the 2nd of December 2013, the second report of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights has been tabled. And shortly after the tabling of the Leg Committee report, the Senate Standing Committee for the Scrutiny of Bills was also tabled. Both of these reports raise very, very serious concerns which go to the limitation, curtailment and indeed extinguishment of a wide range of civil, human and political rights of people working in the building and construction industry. Indeed, both of those committees have written to the Minister for Education and Employment seeking detailed evidence to support the government's assertions that the interference with human rights contained in the bills is necessary, reasonable and proportional. However, the government has yet to provide responses to the concerns of either of these committees. And indeed, the Minister's submissions to this inquiry, to the inquiry of the References Committee, did not provide sufficient details or quality to satisfy the high standard, and there should be a high standard, of proof required to establish that human rights should be interfered with in the manner in which it's intended in the ABCC bills. Throughout the Reference Committee inquiry, we heard evidence from the Department and indeed the Minister the Master Builders Association, the Australian Industry Group. We had an academic paper from Professor Peets. We heard from a range of unions, but in particularly both the Construction, Forestry, Mining and Energy Union gave evidence, as did the Maritime Union of Australia, and then we heard the evidence of the Australian Council of Trade Unions, the ACTU. And that evidence, as the Senate can imagine, was quite different, quite polarising. But what I want to say here today is that the evidence of the Minister and the Department, the MBA and the AIG was really quite inflated and did not go to fact or evidence to support the reintroduction of such draconian legislation, to support the reintroduction of legislation which goes to the heart, the very heart of people's human rights. And certainly both the CFMEU, the MUA and indeed the ACTU said time after time that their approach as trade unions, and indeed the peak body of trade unions, had a zero tolerance towards any form of corruption, a zero tolerance. And whilst that was put on the record, the MBA, the AIG, the Minister completely disregarded that, completely disregarded the views of the unions and the ACTU about their attitudes towards corruption or alleged corruption in the building and construction industry. And indeed it seemed the MBA and indeed the AIG and the department relied on one single report by a company known variously as Econtech and now known as Independent Economics, which is flawed. It is flawed factually, and that has been acknowledged by a range of bodies, but in particular it's been completely discredited by Professor Peets in both a submission to the References Committee but also in an academic peer review paper that Professor Peets reviewed. And it goes to the heart of two key areas. One of the issues that the government kept putting, and the MBA on behalf of the government, was this notion of productivity gain, claiming just a little over 9% productivity gain during the life of the ABCC, despite the fact of Professor Peets, in a methodical, academic way, completely discrediting the 9%, but the facts did not alter the views of the Minister. The productivity gain starts off by comparing the domestic building industry with the multi-storied CBD industry, and it looks at a variety of building work that's done, and one of the areas it looks at is the putting up of a wall. Now, we know in our domestic building sector, particularly with housing, that the architectural design of those houses doesn't change very much, that every second or third or fourth house is simply rearranged on the block or changed slightly, almost building by numbers. And yet Econtech, or Independent Economics, took the building of a wall in the domestic situation and compared that with the building of a wall in a multi-storey, uniquely architecturally designed building, and came up with a cost. Now, the cost was designed by simply phoning building companies, calling building companies who operate in a competitive environment and asking them how much that cost. And on the basis of that, we come up with this absolutely flawed and discredited number on productivity, and nobody who regards themselves as a rigorous academic agrees with that number of productivity. The other area that we heard a lot about from the MBA and the government was this issue of lawlessness. And in fact, they tried at one point to hold up a graph that supported and reported the number of lost days in the sector. And indeed, in evidence, the CFMEU told us that in most of their enterprise bargaining, large majority of it is conducted without any authorised industrial stoppages, which are absolutely authorised under the current Fair Work Act. And what the government tried to do was to take that lost day statistic, that lost day which it wasn't able to say which were authorised days and which weren't, and say somehow there was lawlessness in the building industry. So the government has completely failed on every single test to give any credible evidence, factual evidence, to support the reintroduction of harsh laws which go to the very heart of people's human rights. And indeed, the minister's on the record as saying it's going to combat this alleged lawlessness in the building industry, and yet it only ever goes to civil penalties, despite it using coercive powers which community human rights organisations have said are completely over the top in terms of what they seek to do. So I'm pleased to say that the majority committee has rejected these bills out of hand, and the government should now simply remove them from the Senate. Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker.